Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Spring is almost here, and that means it's time to get back outside and pick up the garden build. Now, we started this last summer. I was able to dig all of the post holes, set all of the posts, but as winter came around, picked up, the weather just wasn't right to be out here working. So, it's starting to warm up, and it's time to get back at it. The section that I'm standing in now is going to be our raised bed section. We're going to do four 4-foot by 8-foot sections. And there's going to be two oriented east-west in this direction, and another two where I'm standing east-west, same direction, same orientation. We only went with 4-foot high fencing here. I think that's going to be enough to keep the rabbits out. It may not be enough to keep the deer out, but if we have an issue with deer, we can put some posts on the outside corners and then run some fishing line between those to keep the deer from jumping over. But we're going to try this to begin with and just see what happens. One of the issues that I'm running into now is that I mocked up with some spray paint the 4-foot by 8-foot beds, and it actually looks like they're going to be a little bit too large. I was hoping to have 3-foot pathways around each of the beds, so 3 feet between the two beds and 3 feet between the bed and the fence on all perimeters. But it doesn't look quite like we're going to have that much space because the posts have come in just a little bit from the original 24-foot wide spacing that I was looking for. So I might have to shrink those down. That's one of the things I'm going to work on today. Once I get all of this grass picked up from when I cut the border and the edging around the post, I'm going to mock up the beds with some simple stake and twine just to see how much clearance I have between the beds, between each bed and the fence. And that'll give us a good idea of whether or not we'll actually be able to get down in between the beds to do work. You don't want to be working in a bed here and having, bumping into the bed behind you. The other reason for that is that you're going to get some overgrowth. Your plants are going to grow. They're going to kind of expand outside of the perimeter of that bed. So if I'm walking through here and there's not enough space, I could have tomatoes that are coming in this direction. I could have peppers that are coming in this direction, and your aisles just get clogged up with vegetation. So we're going to try to avoid that if possible. The other thing that we discovered, or that I discovered in the process of digging out the borders, is that there's actually more of a slope than I expected in this direction here. Now that the grass is gone and I'm standing here looking in this direction, there's a fairly significant slope, which means that our original plan to put the gate here isn't going to work because we're going to have things are just going to be out of level, and I don't want to have to deal with excavating any of the dirt behind the fence or the gate so that it'll swing properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the gate right here. This is almost perfectly flat and perfectly level between this 24-foot run right here. The issue is I got a fence post right in the middle of where my gate is going to be. So I've got to take this post out. I'm going to move it over 2 feet. I'm going to dig another hole, fence post or post hole right here, and set a new 4-foot post there. 6-foot post, 2 feet in the ground, 2 feet above ground. And then we can build the gate and it'll swing perfectly. I won't have to dig out any more grass. And I think it'll just work a lot better. Visually, it'll look a lot better having the gate in plane with the rest of the fence versus if we put it in the original location, the gate is going to be out of plane with the fence because of that slope. So, got a lot of work to do today, and I think it's probably time to stop talking and get started. So last summer, I rented a sod cutter, and I set the depth just below the root line so that I was removing as little of that soil, as little of that topsoil layer as possible. Makes it a little bit easier when you're trying to remove the grass, whether you're going to dig it up or you can roll it up in some cases. But if you just take these big clumps, I mean, this is going to weigh 4 or 5 pounds right here, just because most of that is soil, and you toss it, again, you're removing a lot of the material, a lot of that soil that you don't necessarily need to remove, and it would be better off if it stayed in place where it was. So what I like to do is I like to remove the grass. In this case, when I use that Pickmatic right there to kind of cut underneath it, and I piled it up kind of out of the way. And I let it dry for a couple of days, because this grass in this soil is going to retain a lot of moisture and it's going to be really heavy. But if you let it sit out in the sun, we've had some really nice sunny days the last couple of days, it will really dry out, and you can just kind of bounce it around a little bit, and a lot of that soil will fall off. And then when you're removing this material, you're not taking all the soil with it. Just one of the little things I like to point out as I'm going along in a project like this. All right, so I've spent a few minutes with a second technique that I really like in a large area that we're working with, or when you're working in a large area like this, and that is a hard tine rake. This works really well for separating the soil from the roots of the grass. And what you end up doing is I just kind of pick at it, and every time I hit those clumps of grass with those tines, it separates the two and it breaks it apart. So by the time I end up at the end of a row like this, what I've got is just a clump of grass with just a little bit of soil left and a lot of loose roots. And all of that soil is spread out evenly over the area that I just raked. It's a great way to make some fast progress. And you know, you're not trying to get every piece of dirt out of here. You're not trying to get all the soil out of here. You're just trying to loosen it up enough so that you don't have a big clump of soil at the bottom of that root base, because you want to keep it here if possible. Another easy trick, another easy way to separate those two out and keep this soil where you want it. All right, guys, once you have all of your grass either cleaned out or covered up, right now I've got all of the border cut and I've cleaned out all of the grass that I pulled off of the border. I shook it out, got as much of the dirt and soil off of it as I could, and I've spread that around in this enclosure here. So once you've got that done, the next step that I like to do is I like to start laying out where my beds are going to go. And in this case, I think I actually designed the beds to be too large for the space. So my original plan was to do 4 beds that were 4 feet by 8 feet each. And as I've started to lay it out, I think that's actually going to be a little bit too big. And it's always better to find that out on the front end. If you build your beds, cut all your boards, bring them down to your garden where you're going to install them, and you start to put them together, and you put 2 or 3 of them together and you realize that they're just too big for the space, well, then you got a problem, because you got to go back and you got to disassemble it, you got to recut it. So I always like to spend a few minutes on the front end laying it out, making sure that it works spatially, making sure that it looks good before you actually finish off the beds that you're gonna build. If you're buying pre-manufactured beds, then you can't really cut those down to size. You're gonna have to work with what you have. But in our case, a little bit overzealous and probably designed them to be a little bit too large. So a couple of things you can do really easily. Take some stakes. These are just some old, like a white picket fence that I found. I cut them up and I turned them into stakes. Or an even better technique is to use plywood. Or in our case, particle board. Now this is a 4x8 sheet of particle board. If you were doing 3x8s or 7x3s, you could take a piece of particle board like this. This is just scrap I had left over from another project, and lay it down. And boom, there's your bed. This is exactly what a 4x8 bed would look like. So what I'm going to do is, instead of trying to measure it all out and put these stakes in, I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to take 2.5 feet off of all of the perimeter, and I'm going to line the board up so that I've got it parallel or perpendicular to each of the walls. And then I can take these stakes and I can just make a little indentation where they're going to go, move the plywood out, and put the stakes in. And I can repeat that process. That's going to make it much faster than trying to take these stakes and measure out each of these beds, because it's really difficult since there's no walls, all I've got is posts. It's really difficult to get an accurate measurement. I probably spent 15 minutes just trying to lay out these 4 stakes here. I did move it once, but this is going to take 30 seconds versus 15 minutes to try and lay this out and square it up. So what I'll do is I'll just take my tape. My original plan was to do 3-foot borders or 3-foot perimeters around the beds. I've already figured out that that is too much because the beds end up being condensed in the center with only about 1.5 feet or 2 feet of space for a walkway. Like I said earlier, that's just not enough. You're not going to be able to get in there and work. You need to get down on your knees. You're going to have plants growing, potentially growing over into each other's beds. So this has been reduced. This layout here has already been reduced to a 2.5 foot perimeter around the bed. So 2.5 feet between the bed and the wall. So what I'm going to do is the same thing with this piece here. I'm going to do 2.5 feet, put the stakes in, 2.5 feet here, 2.5 feet there with my original 4x8 beds, and just see if I can make it work. If not, I'll have to shrink it. I'll have to go to maybe 3x8 or 3x7 or something like that. Because I think it would be better to have more space around the beds, make it easier to walk, make it easier to get a wheelbarrow in if we need to bring in more materials to dump into the beds. It's just going to make working in this space better if we have a little bit more room to maneuver around the beds. So let me get this one staked out, and then we'll move it over and do the other 2. I'll probably go ahead and redo this one just so it's consistent, and then we'll take a look and see how that layout works. So the process of laying all of this out took me about 10 minutes, and it's much simpler than trying to lay out each individual stake, take measurements, and do it that way. So if you can, I highly recommend it. If you're only doing 1 bed, it's not that big a deal. If you're only doing 2 beds, maybe not worth it. But if you're doing 4 beds like we are, I recommend trying to find something to use as a template. It just makes the process go much faster. The next step is taking some mason line and tying it off on the corners and the perimeter of each of these beds so that it gives us an even better visualization of the size of these beds and what they're going to look like when they're finished. So let's get started with that. Actually looking really good. We can move the beds in a little bit closer. We can move this one in a little bit closer. We can move that one in a little bit closer. End up with about a 4-foot aisle in the middle. This aisle or walkway right here is about 3 feet 3 inches, which I think is perfect. And then we'll have more space between the fence here and the walls, the outside walls of the beds. Super excited. I think this is really going to come together, and looking forward to sharing the rest of the build with you. All right, guys, rookie mistake. Don't forget your box cutter is in your back pocket. You sit on it and you might get a little bit of a poke. Really excited with the progress that we made today. Visualizing what you're building and being able to look at it in 3 dimensions makes a huge difference. I think in the end result, like I said earlier, after I had laid everything out, I realized that the 4x8 beds will actually work, so that's great because I wanted to get as much bed as I could, get as much produce in there as possible, get as much veg in there as possible. Next time, we're going to be building the beds, so I'm using 1x8 locally sourced, locally sawn red cedar. I'm really excited about that. I'm going to make them double height, so they're actually going to be about 16 inches, 14 to 16 inches, depending on what side of the slope you're on. We'll be able to get a lot of compost and raised bed mix in there. There's a great company close to us that produces their own raised bed mix, which we've got some friends that have used it and they said it's amazing. You'll have incredible production. So we're looking forward to that. But thanks again for watching. Be safe out there. Cheers. We'll catch you in the next one. Ow! Don't sit on your box cutter.